I want to take just a moment to talk a little bit about the reading of poetry and to explore some beliefs about how poetry should be read that, in my experience, interfere with people's proper understanding of what's going on in a poem and contribute to misunderstandings of the text. I call these the myths of poetry, common beliefs about what poetry is and how poetry works that confuse people. Okay, so I have 4 myths of poetry that I want to address. The first myth of poetry is the idea that poetry is some sort of mysterious language that requires decoding, and that when you graduate from poetry school, they give you the secret code book. And then when you read a poem, you refer to this secret, mysterious knowledge, and you look through the code book and you look up what these words mean. And then you find this mysterious hidden meaning that the normal layperson can't ever know. Because clearly poetry is mysterious and it can't mean what it seems to mean. Well, I think that's a real problem because, in fact, poetry works just like any other linguistic production. It is there intended to deliver a meaning, and if the poem is unsuccessful in delivering that meaning, it is unsuccessful as a form of communication. Now, sophisticated and intricate poems are capable of producing multiple levels of meaning through sophisticated poetic effects, but that doesn't mean that you discard the primary surface meaning of the poem. Some people tend to approach the poem as though it's a box of cereal. Once you get the cereal out, you finished eating and enjoying the contents, you discard the container. But in fact, the container is the cereal here. The medium is the message. And so you have to look at and take the surface meaning into account. The surface meaning is what the poem means. And then it may also introduce multiple levels of meaning through irony or through allegory, but nevertheless, you don't discard the surface meaning as irrelevant. And the language that we're using in poems is exactly the same language we use in every other form of communication, including the form of communication coming out of my mouth right now. So those people who believe that you have to decode the poem to find its meaning end up missing the significance of the apparent surface meaning. They discard it. Myth number 2. People tend to believe that you read the poem line by line, that the line is a determinate element of meaning in the poem, and they ignore the punctuation. And what that causes them to do is to read words or whole lines out of context. It's like you went through and listened to someone talk and you selectively picked out words of their conversation and didn't listen to the rest and then tried to understand what they were saying from that. Words have a meaning in context, especially in an analytical language like English, where the position of the word in the sentence determines how it functions in that sentence and what its meaning is in that sentence in relationship to the other words around it. If you pull lines or you pull words out of context, you are going to misunderstand them. So you cannot look at the poem as though it is a series of separate lines. Looking at the poem as a series of separate discrete lines will cause you to vastly misunderstand or misread the poem and not be able to understand what it's actually saying. Let's look at an example of that. Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess, which we will be reading later in the semester, begins with these lines. Now imagine if I read these lines like this, one line at a time. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall. Looking as if she were alive, I call. That piece of wonder now, Frau Pandolf's hands. Worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her, I said? Now clearly that doesn't make any sense because you're ignoring the punctuation. As in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the prologue is accused of not standing on his points, and that's what's happening here. The lines come out jumbled because you're reading it ignoring the punctuation. Sentences in poetry function the same way as sentences in prose or speech. You read the punctuation. The punctuation determines where the sentence begins and ends. If you ignore the punctuation, it's not going to make any sense, and you end up misreading the poem. Browning's poem is using enjambment. It's using what is known as run-on lines, where the end punctuation doesn't correspond with the end of the line. So if you read the first lines of the poem properly, it would sound like this. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Now you notice that's 2 sentences. And if you read it just the first couple of lines discreetly, you wouldn't understand what it's saying, because that whole set of lines, all the way down to line 13, are 2 sentences. And you have to read each sentence completely before you understand it. The third and related myth of poetry is the myth of symbolism, that poems are bags of symbols, and you pull the symbols out separately and you interpret the symbols. And once you have decoded that symbol and attached it to some meaning, then you put all the meanings together and you come up with the meaning of the poem. But once again, looking at a poem as though it's just this grab bag full of symbols and the intervening words don't matter will cause you to misunderstand, misread the poem badly. Because apparently insignificant words like conjunctions or prepositions can vastly change how to understand that word. So it's important that you read whole sentences following the punctuation. You read every word in the sentence, that you don't skip over words, even words that seem insignificant like prepositions or articles. They can change the meaning of the sentence significantly. The fourth myth is the myth of poetic intention. And usually when you hear someone say this, they'll say, oh, the poet didn't mean that. The poet didn't intend that meaning. Clearly, the poet couldn't have intended to mean that. And there are 2 problems with this myth. It's the myth of authorial intention. And the first problem is that in many cases, we can't know what the poet intended because they didn't leave a record and they're dead and we can't ask them. And unless you're a medium and can conduct a seance, you're not going to know. We can't know what the poem intended. All we have is the words on the page. And if the words on the page produce that meaning, then they have that meaning whether the poet intended it or not. To say that language means only what it's intended to mean ignores how language works. Language is a communication that takes place within the context of a language system that everyone understands. And that understanding is produced by not only the person speaking, but also the person hearing. And if the person hearing hears a meaning there, even if the person speaking didn't intend that meaning, it doesn't mean the meaning isn't there. So there are 2 reasons that the authorial intention does not determine the meaning of the poem. The first one is, actually there are 3 reasons. The first one is that we can't know the poet's intention in most cases. The second case is that the intention doesn't control what speech means. Speech means what speech means, independent of intention. And the third one is the poet may not, him or herself, even know what they intended. It's very possible for people to say things expressing a subconscious intention that they aren't really aware of or conscious of. That happens all the time in the real world. People will speak and something will come out that they didn't intend, but they do believe. And it happens in literature as well. The most famous example I can think of is Charles Dickens' novel David Copperfield. Charles Dickens' novel David Copperfield is clearly, to anyone who has read the novel and knows anything about Dickens' life, a revised autobiography. That David Copperfield is Dickens' ideal self. And many of the things that happened to David Copperfield came from Dickens' real life. In fact, most of the things that happened to David Copperfield happened to Dickens in his real life. The most famous of which is that young Dickens, when he was 9 years old, we'll talk about this in detail later, was sent to work at a blacking factory when his family was imprisoned for debt. And this was a pivotal event in his life. In every single novel, there is some reference, some hidden covert reference to Warren's Blacking, the place that he worked. Blacking is shoe polish. Or to 22 Hungerford Stairs, where the Warren's Blacking was located next to the Thames River. Nevertheless, he never during his life told anyone about this experience. And the only reason we know about it is because he gave a short autobiographical fragment to his closest friend, John Forster, without comment. And after his death, John Forster published it in his biography. That's the only reason we know. So it was always in his mind, but he never told anyone about it. Nevertheless, something extremely similar happens to David Copperfield. David Copperfield's initials, DC, are the reverse of Charles Dickens' initials, CD, sort of an anagram, an initial anagram. And yet, Charles Dickens himself was not aware he was writing his own autobiography. Even though he didn't intend it to be an autobiography, it's hard not to see it that way, because clearly there was some sort of subconscious auto-confessional impulse. The last myth of poetry is the myth of personal taste as a method of critical judgment. And what that means is that people mistake, I like this poem, for it is a good poem. Those are two very separate things. It is very possible for people to like bad poetry. On the other hand, it is very possible for people not to like good poetry, because why one likes something is not what makes it good. Personal taste depends upon what you like and don't like, and you can like or not like whatever you want. I happen to think Charles Dickens is a wonderful author. You may not. That's fine. That's your right as a human being. I don't particularly like the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley. To me, it seems overly intellectualized and just stilted. Some people love Shelley's poetry. The whole 19th century revered Shelley. So my personal taste says that I don't like Shelley and I do like Dickens. Whereas most of the early 20th century didn't like Dickens. Now, that's personal taste. Critical judgment is based upon a much more objective criteria about how effective the poem is, whether it uses the various means of poetry, including diction and tropes, personification, metaphor, metonymy, various kinds of linguistic tropes, whether it uses meter or rhyme effectively in order to produce its meaning. That's what makes poetry critically, objectively good, independent of personal taste. So if you say something like, I don't like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, it's a bad poem, that's a non sequitur. That doesn't make any sense. That's like saying, I don't like physics. Physics is stupid. Well, that I don't like physics doesn't make physics stupid. That one doesn't like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock doesn't make it a bad poem. What makes a poem a bad poem is it uses the various poetic elements ineffectively or poorly to produce a bad, poorly written, ineffective, or jumbled poem. So, when you read the poems, the most important things to keep in mind are that you need to read the poem sentence by sentence, the same way you would read prose, and tease out the surface meaning first. Take that surface meaning seriously, and then go on and look deeper for other ways of producing deeper levels or multiple levels of meaning that may exist in the poem. Most often, the deeper levels of meaning simply reinforce the superficial meaning, but in some cases, they complicate it through irony. So it is important to understand the surface meaning and to read it, and to avoid reading parts of the poem out of context. Make sure you understand them within the context of the sentence. Pulling individual words out of a sentence and treating those as the only things that have any meaning will cause you to vastly misunderstand what the poem is saying.